Andrew, you've been back from Syria just a few weeks. What's the mood of the churches there?
Yes, I've been visiting faith communities and faith leaders in Syria now for a few years, and I've just returned from my 10th visit in 4 years, and travelling all over the country and meeting with various faith community leaders, both Christian and Muslim. Speaking particularly of the churches have suffered terribly in Syria, as indeed has everybody of all the communities in Syria, due to the extremism and the violence of the conflict. Many Christians have left. You'd find that in the areas that were occupied by the so-called rebels, there are no Christians left. The churches in those areas have been destroyed, and the Christians were either killed or fled. In government-controlled areas, the churches have survived. There's wonderful resilience amongst the Christian communities in those that remain. Many have left partly because of the economic difficulties as well.
Where have they gone?
Many have gone to Europe or America, or wherever they can, or to other areas of the Middle East, or to families elsewhere in the world. But it's estimated that about 50%, some say more than that, of the Christian communities have left Syria. But those that remain, remember that Syria is hugely diverse in its Christian makeup. I think all the 5 Christian families of the church are represented in Syria, and almost every single denomination is there. And despite the loss in numbers, the churches are remaining. But I think they feel, actually very neglected by the outside world.
Why is that?
There is an assumption or a misrepresentation by many, and particularly in this country, they've been presented as supporting the Syrian government.
What's wrong with that?
Well, yes.
We're told to pray for our government,
yes.
to obey our government.
And a lovely quote from one of the Christian leaders, actually, just a few weeks ago, said, we support our legitimate government. And we're also a critical voice, and I've heard this from many Syrian leaders. We support the legitimate government, which has supported the minority communities for many years, and Christianity, as in all the faith communities, have been able to flourish in Syria over the years. We're also a critical voice, and a lovely way that this particular church leader put it, we are the pH balance of Syrian society. And so they said we support the secular constitution, and of course the vast majority of the opposition are extremist Islamist groups, jihadist groups, that have wiped out not just Christian communities, but of course anybody who opposes their ideology. So I've been in areas that have been liberated from those groups, and the churches and the mosques are completely destroyed, and anybody who didn't support their ideology have been either killed or fled. So it's natural that the church communities support the legitimate government, and they say that if there was another legitimate government came, then we would support that legitimate government. And seek to live in a society that is secular by nature and not living under some sort of extremist rule. So that's where they stand. This has been, I think, very unfairly interpreted by many in the West, or many of the Western churches, as supporting the regime, as we put it.
Why? So how do the church leaders in Syria view the church here in the West?
That's a very good question. I think with disappointment. I've talked with quite a number of church leaders in Syria. There have been some comments made here in England, I think, that have evoked actually quite deep resentment amongst church leaders in Syria. It was said, for example, in the Church Times recently that Syrian church leaders are slaves to Assad. Well, actually, that's absolute nonsense, and that's deeply offensive to the church leaders in Syria. And a disappointment that actually church leaders have refused to engage with the church leaders in Syria. You've got in Syria Christians who are struggling to survive, living alongside their Muslim brothers and sisters and people of other communities, all of whom have suffered horrendously at the hands of extremism and the violence from all sides. And it seems that the West is actually ignoring the voices of the vast majority of Syrians in the country who are trying to survive and exist.
So for Christians here in the West who to some extent depend on what the media tells us about Syria, what would your message to them be? To Christians here in the UK?
To the Christians in the UK, I would say it's high time we started really listening to the people, the voices of the people inside Syria, and listening to the faith communities in Syria, and listening to the Christians in Syria. They have a message. I was talking to the Armenian Catholic priest in Kesab. Now, Kesab was occupied by multiple rebel groups, including groups that we label moderates. In 2013, 2014, they desecrated the churches and dug up graves and pulled up the bones of priests and things, and all sorts of horrible things that these rebels did. And I spoke to one of the priests there, and he said, "We know what we're going through. Don't judge us, but come and listen to us. Come and talk with us. Come and share with us." Another archbishop in Aleppo I spoke to, and he said, "Come and support us and help us to stay here, to be the Christian community here." A Muslim in Damascus, a writer, he said to me, "I speak to you as a Muslim." He said, "Don't worry about us Muslims in Syria." He said, "Worry about the Christian communities here. Because if we lose the Christian communities in Syria, the whole nature of Syrian society, indeed the whole nature of the Levant, the diversity and plurality of the region will be shattered. And that will affect the whole world and the nature of the Christian community, the whole wide world through. If we neglect the Christians of the Middle East and neglect the Christians of Syria, which we have been doing, we do a great disservice to Christianity and forget that actually it's Syrian Christians who brought us Christianity. They are the root of our faith. You know, they nurtured St. Paul in his faith when he was converted. It was Syrian Christians who nurtured St. Paul. We have them.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic about Syria at the moment for the future?
I think if we listen to the people of Syria themselves, if we listen objectively and stop just listening to one side, if we go and see the realities, again people there say, "Come and visit us." You know, the refusal of political leaders, of church leaders to actually go and visit. Who are holding the beacon, if you like, of Christianity in the region and suffering for it. And they feel that we are supporting the people who are causing their suffering. It's time that we went and stood alongside them and listened to them and started being partners in the gospel.
Thank you.
Thank you.